Today you're going to be in Matthew 8, verses 18 through 22. Go ahead and give it a pause and read that and see what you get from those few verses and come back. So in this passage, Jesus is talking about the cost of following him. And I think some people are kind of under the impression that being a Christian means that at the moment of salvation, the rest of our lives is just going to be all rainbows and unicorns. That for some reason, being a follower of Christ means that magically all the bad things in our lives will disappear and nothing bad will ever happen to you anymore. And then all of your adult life is just going to be wealth and health and all good things coming to you. And while on one level, Christians should be more joyous and happy because of their beliefs, but at the same time, the Bible certainly does not promise that Christians will never face hardships. In fact, Jesus actually spends quite a bit of time teaching the contrary. And so in today's passage, we'll kind of see what is one of the first of the thinning of the herds moment, you may call it. Up until this point, people have pretty much just seen the cool parts of Jesus' ministry, you might call it. They've seen his miraculous healings. They've seen him work signs and wonders. And I mean, who wouldn't want to follow someone like that has command over nature and the supernatural? I mean, surely following someone like this must be easy if he wields such power. But Jesus makes it clear that this is not the case. You know, just a few chapters beforehand, Jesus uses an example of wild animals to talk about how if the Father cares for the animals, surely he's going to care even more for the creation that's made in his image. And now Jesus once again draws on the wild animals and says, hey, they have a home, and yet the Son of Man doesn't even have a place to lay his head. And so what Jesus is talking about is he's saying, hey, my ministry is on the move. Most nights they were probably sleeping out in the wilderness. Probably not the most fun camp out in the world, sleeping under the stars. And even on the best of nights, they were sleeping in borrowed rooms at some of his followers' houses when they came into a town. And so as Jesus gets away from this, he then points towards the urgency and the priority that following him takes on our lives. And so biblically speaking, our relationship with God is like our top tier priority in life. And then under that comes our family, and then maybe it's our work, and then it's, other things up under that. But God is supposed to be our number one priority. Our relationship with him is supposed to be our number one priority. And we can always find reasons not to follow Jesus, or to put off following Jesus, or to put off something that Jesus is calling us to do. And so that's why it's so important that we put him first. If we don't move when he tells us to move, it's going to be a whole lot harder to do it after we've delayed it and procrastinated it several times. And, these passages talking about the cost of following Jesus, they're certainly not one-off events. There are at least a half a dozen or more just in Matthew and John where Jesus lays out what it costs to follow him. I picked out a few just to go over. There's one in Matthew 5 where Jesus says that the cost of following him will be persecution, to expect persecution for following him. There's one in John 15 where he says, if the world treated me in this way, if they saw all of these signs and wonders and still chose to reject me and brutalize me and persecute me and put me to death, then you shouldn't expect much of a different treatment. If they treat the master this way, they're going to treat the servants that way as well. Then in Matthew 16, Jesus says to be one of his followers, we have to deny our own desires. We have to deny our fleshly, worldly desires and put him first. And the way he says this is that we must take up our cross and follow him. I think that last verse is especially impactful, because in the Roman world, part of the crucifixion was that if the soldiers had not already beat this person to the point that they were physically unable to, the Roman government would force the person to carry their cross to the execution. And so that added some element to the public humiliation. It once again just wore the person down even more. But the biggest thing it did is that it served as a final act of submission to the Roman government. To kind of, in the end, the Roman government wins, and this criminal's being forced to carry the instrument of their death. on their backs, and so it was served as a sign of submission. And so Jesus isn't using this as an example of saying, hey, I'm leading you guys to your execution. But what he is drawing on is that this cross is a sign of submission, and by us taking up our cross to follow Jesus, he's saying that we must submit everything in our lives to Christ. And so it's kind of an outward display of our identifying with him. And so as I think of the application of this, I think what we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to individually pay the price to follow Jesus? I can't decide that for you guys. Your parents can't decide that for you. Pastor Charlie can't decide that for you. We each individually have to weigh the cost and decide if we are willing to pay the cost to follow Jesus. And if we say we are, we need to look at areas of our lives and see if we're actually living that out. I can't help but think back to just a few chapters ago where Jesus mentioned the people that they come to their end of their lives and they meet the judgment seat and they cry out, Lord, Lord. And yet Jesus says, I never knew you. You're not one of mine. And he casts them out. And, I wonder, perhaps these people knew of Jesus, yet they had never counted the cost, and they had never carried their cross. They had never accepted Jesus as their Savior. Perhaps they never truly submitted to Christ's lordship in their life by taking up their cross and following him. So perhaps they knew him. Perhaps they had never truly followed him. And so as I think about that, I think we ask, what are our priorities in life? What is our number one priority in life? Are we proudly identifying ourselves with Jesus despite the persecution that we face? Or do we prioritize our social standing with our peers or our friends over identifying with Christ? As we can ask, is Jesus, is he Lord in all areas of our lives? Or are there places where we're putting other things in front of him? And so through that self-survey, we can kind of begin to understand, do we have our priorities straight? And have we truly counted that cost? So that'd be my encouragement as the takeaway from this. Ask yourselves, have you counted the cost? And if so, it's good.